In first century Rome, the empire seemed indestructible. Its marble gleamed beneath the Mediterranean sun, generals returned from victories, and the people filled the amphitheaters to celebrate the glory of Caesar. But behind all that splendor hid a world of excess, fear, and madness, a stage on which absolute power could turn any life to tragedy. It is in this setting that we meet Sporus, a young man of uncommon beauty who, without knowing it, would be drawn into the heart of Emperor Nero's insanity. Sporus was a libertus, a freed slave who had earned a measure of autonomy within the imperial household. Yet despite his formal freedom, he remained bound to the whims of power, and that power had a name: Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the man who ruled the world with the same intensity with which he destroyed everything he loved. Accounts from the time describe Sporus as a boy with delicate features, gentle eyes, and an almost ethereal presence, someone whose beauty could not go unnoticed in an empire obsessed with appearance and pleasure. He lived among servants and courtiers, just another face in the vast Roman court, until the day fate crossed his path with that of the emperor. By then, Nero was a man consumed by scandal and instability. After years of feasts, extravagance, and misrule, Rome had begun to whisper about his madness. The city still smelled of ashes from the Great Fire of 64 AD, and many believed the emperor himself had ordered it. His public image swung between artist and tyrant, genius and monster. But it was the death of Poppaea Sabina, his second wife, that plunged him into a void with no return. Poppaea had been Nero's great love and his greatest obsession. Beautiful, influential, and ambitious, she ruled the emperor's heart as easily as she manipulated. When she died, accounts differ. Some said Nero, in a fit of rage, struck and killed her while she was pregnant. Others blamed complications in childbirth. What matters is that the loss destroyed him from within, became a man chasing a ghost. And that was when Sporus, innocent and unaware, was noticed. They say Nero saw him by chance, perhaps during a ceremony, perhaps in a palace corridor, and was struck by the resemblance between the young man and the dead Poppaea. It was as if his lost wife had returned to life. To anyone else, it might have been a curious coincidence, but to Nero, it was a divine revelation. The obsession began quietly, like a shadow. At first, the emperor merely watched Sporus from afar. Then he began summoning him often, praising his face, his walk, the tone of his voice. Gradually, admiration turned into fascination, and fascination into desire. Not the ordinary desire of a lover, but that of a man determined to recreate the woman he had lost, no matter the cost. Sporus, still very young, likely had no full grasp of the danger surrounding him. In the imperial household, defying Nero was unthinkable. And when the emperor decided to transform the boy into the living image of his dead wife, nothing and no one could stop him. What followed was one of the darkest episodes in Roman history. Nero ordered that Sporus be castrated. The young man was taken to the imperial physicians, and under the cold flicker of torchlight, his manhood was torn away in the name of the emperor's madness. He was no longer a man, but a project, a replacement molded to the ruler's will. This mutilation was not only physical, it was symbolic. Sporus lost his identity, his voice, his freedom to exist. He became a prisoner of a role he had never chosen, that of Poppaea. The marble palace, which to many symbolized glory, became a theater of horror, where Nero staged day after day the drama of his own delusion. And Sporus, with his angelic face and silent gaze, became the unwilling protagonist of that. From that moment on, his life would never be the same. He would be dressed, treated, and displayed as a woman, as the empress whom the emperor refused to let. The story of Sporus is, above all, a cruel reminder of how power, when unrestrained, can destroy not only bodies but soul, of how beauty, in a world ruled by madness, can be both a gift and a sentence, and of how love, when corrupted by obsession, ceases to be human and monstrous. Nero's grief was not that of an ordinary man. It was the grief of an emperor who believed that nothing, not even death, could deny him what he desired. When Poppaea Sabina died, the empire fell silent. All of Rome knew that something terrible had happened, but few dared to speak of it. Some said Nero, in a fit of rage, had struck her with a fatal kick. Others whispered it was an accident, a difficult childbirth. But deep down, no one doubted that the emperor was to blame. And that guilt, mingled with love and madness, became a storm with Nero wandered through the corridors of his golden palace like a ghost. At night, it was said he would call out Poppaea's name aloud, as if she could still hear him. He ordered her chambers to be prepared, the candles lit, the room perfumed, and fresh flowers laid upon the bed they had once shared. No servant dared disobey, for they knew that the emperor's mourning was. Nero's sorrow was not mere grief. It was an open wound rotting into delirium. From that emptiness, obsession was born. He did not want merely to remember Pop. He wanted to recreate her. Death had stolen from him the woman he loved, and the only power left to him was to force the world to imitate her. It was in this state of silent insanity that the emperor's gaze fell upon Sporus. The young freedman, so similar to Poppaea in features and expression, seemed like an apparition, a living memory of everything Nero had. To the emperor, this was no coincidence. It was destiny, and like a deranged artist, he decided to mold that memory to his own will. The first signs of madness were almost subtle. Nero began calling Sporus by the same affectionate names he had used for his dead wife. He ordered him to wear garments like those Poppaea had once worn, just to remember the good times, he said. Gradually, the comparisons became command. Sporus was to smile as she did, walk as she did, speak as she did. With every gesture, Nero saw the past revived, and with every resemblance, his madness. It was as though he believed he could deceive death itself, and the price of that illusion was the soul of an innocent boy. The palace walls, gilded and lined with mirrors, became silent witnesses to a macabre farce. Nero spoke to Sporus as he had to Poppaea, telling him the same stories, repeating the same promises, even the same jealous rages. It was an intimate, twisted theater where the emperor was the star and Sporus the captive actor, trapped on stage with no exit. For the young man, every glance from Nero was a mix of fascination and terror. He knew he could not refuse and that any mistake could mean death. Slowly, the people of Rome began to hear whispers. Gossip spread through the public baths and markets. The Caesar had gone mad, they said. He was trying to bring his dead wife back to life. But no one dared speak too loudly. The Praetorian Guard ensured silence. Even the senators, masters of hypocrisy, grew uneasy at the sight of Nero walking beside the young man who dressed and spoke like the dead empress. It was a spectacle of decadence and of fear. Nero, however, seemed to live in another world. His mourning was no longer sorrow. It had become ritual. He ordered ceremonies in Poppaea's honor, and in those ceremonies, her role was performed by Sporus. The young man was displayed before guests, adorned with jewels and gowns, his face painted in the style of Roman matron. The emperor watched him with tearful eyes, convinced that his wife had returned in a new form. The court pretended to believe, and so, amid false applause and terrified silence, tragedy took shape. Then Nero made his final and cruelest decision. If Sporus was the perfect reflection of Poppaea, then he must be transformed completely. Disguise was not enough. The body itself must be remade. The palace physicians received the order. The young man was to be castrated. None dared object. It is said the operation took place in the imperial chambers, in secret, while the sound of harps and flutes drowned out the boy's scream. When it was over, Sporus was no longer the same. That act marked the point of no return, the moment Nero's grief became absoluteness. From then on, the emperor devoted himself to his fantasy with the zeal of a fanatic priest. He began treating Sporus as his wife, calling him my Sabina, dressing him in the dead woman's clothes, bringing him to banquets, performances, even public ceremony. Rome watched in disbelief as its emperor paraded hand in hand with what seemed to be a woman, but whom everyone knew to be a mutilated youth. The most terrifying thing of all was that Nero no longer saw the different. In his mind, the transformation was Poppaea lived again. Nero's mourning had become Sporus's prison, a cage made of gold, silk, and fear. And every gesture of affection from the emperor was a cruel reminder of all he had lost. The beauty that once made Sporus noticed had now become his curse. In Nero's Rome, where power was absolute and sanity scarce, the young man's life became the darkest mirror of an emperor who had confused love with domination and memory with possession. The day of Sporus's castration was never recorded in official chronicles, yet it remained engraved in Rome's collective memory as one of the most brutal acts of the imperial age. Within the gilded palace, beneath vaulted ceilings of marble and gold, the young man's fate was sealed in silence. Nero, wrapped in grief and delusion, saw in that act a way to repair his pain. To him, it was not violence. It was, his distorted mind, an act of love, a sacred sacrifice through which Poppaea would be reborn. But for Sporus, it was the moment his life ceased to belong to him. The imperial physicians, long accustomed to obeying the whims of Caesar, carried out the order without protest. It is said the procedure took place amid silks and perfumes, so that the atmosphere might not offend the emperor's sensitivities. The muffled sound of flutes echoed through the corridor, perhaps to drown out the scream that power refused to hear. When it was over, Sporus was no longer a man, nor could he ever become what Nero wanted him. He had become something in between, a creature sculpted by madness. In the days that followed, Nero displayed a calm almost religious. He wandered through the gardens of the Domus Aurea, the Golden Palace, with his eyes fixed on something no one else could see. He told his courtiers that Poppaea had returned. He ordered new jewels, gowns, and crowns prepared, choosing each piece himself with the care of a devoted bridegroom. Though what was to come was anything but love. The wedding ceremony was announced as a public event. All of Rome buzzed, shocked, confused, and fearful. Some believed it was merely another imperial whim. Others feared the emperor had finally gone irretrievably. When the day came, the palace filled with guests, senators, generals, priests, and nobles, all summoned by imperial decree. None could. The hall was lit by hundreds of oil lamps. At its center stood Nero, crowned with laurels and dressed in the ceremonial attire of a Roman groom. To the sound of harps, the doors opened, and Sporus entered, dressed in the white silk mantle that had once belonged to the real Poppaea. Adorned with jewels and veiled, he walked slowly forward beneath the petrified gazes of. The silence was almost total. Each step he took sounded like a blow to Rome's moral heart. Nero smiled. To him, this was the reunion promised by the god. He took Sporus's trembling hands, small, cold, afraid, and declared before all that his beloved had returned to life. He called him Sabina, Poppaea's name. The assembled crowd, bound by imperial power, responded with forced. The ceremony continued with the traditional rites of Roman marriage, transformed into a grotesque parody. The emperor placed a ring on the young man's finger, and the priests, pale and silent, murmured blessings that sounded more like curses. When all was done, Nero kissed Sporus before the court. What should have been a symbol of love looked more like a mark of possession. From that moment on, Sporus was no longer an individual. He was the empress. The emperor ordered that everyone in the court address him with female titles, that servants bow before him as Caesar's wife, and that the name Sporus be erased. The young man was now officially Sabina, a living symbol of a lie born of goodness. The days that followed were a parade of opulence and shame. Nero displayed his wife at banquets, theaters, and processions. He insisted on bringing him everywhere in public, dressing him in sheer tunics and crowns of gold. Rome watched, stunned and powerless, as the most powerful empire in the world was ruled by a man who had married a mutilated reflection. There was horror, but there was also fear, for under Nero, the line between obedience and death was far too thin. For Sporus, each morning was a new prison. The palace was a golden cage. He ate, slept, and breathed under watch, forced to perform a role he had never chosen. His body ached, but it was his soul that suffered. At night, before the mirror, he might still glimpse the face of the boy he once was, but he no longer recognized. The emperor called him "my beloved Sabina," and the echo of that lie reverberated through every chamber of the palace. The marriage of Nero and Sporus was both the climax and the symbol of imperial decay. In his desperate attempt to replace lost love, the emperor had destroyed not only another life, but also what remained of Rome's dignity. That spectacle was not a union. It was a coronation of madness, and Sporus, now dressed as an empress, stood as the living portrait of an empire beginning to crumble from within. After the wedding, Rome awoke to a new reality, one in which reason had completely surrendered to delirium. Sporus, the young freedman who had once dreamed only of peace within the walls of the imperial household, was now a living prop in the most bizarre spectacle the empire had ever seen. They called him Empress, and no one dared contradict the. Through the corridors of the Domus Aurea, the titles that had once belonged to the real Poppaea Sabina now echoed, attached to her human copy. Sporus had become a ghost dressed in silk. From dawn until nightfall, his life was an unending performance. Servants dressed him in feminine tunics, adjusted his jewelry, and arranged his hair to resemble the portraits of Poppaea. Every detail was monitored by watchful eyes. Nero's eye, always searching for flaws, for the smallest gesture that might remind him that this illusion was just that, an illusion. And yet, the emperor seemed to believe it. He called Sporus "my Sabina," whispered verses of love, and led him through the imperial gardens with the tenderness of a man caressing a dream he refused to. But Nero's dream was Sporus's nightmare. Each passing day, he felt himself fading. The words he spoke were no longer his own. The way he walked, smiled, even breathed, now belonged to the memory of a dead woman. He lived under the constant gaze of a man both powerful and unstable, one who could embrace him tenderly in one moment and humiliate him. The entire empire revolved around the whim of a single man, and Sporus, now reshaped by imperial will, stood as living proof that absolute power does not create gods. It creates monsters. Nero displayed him publicly with pride. At feasts and spectacles, he sat beside the young man, presenting him as his wife. When he traveled to Greece, he brought Sporus along, dressed as a Roman empress, covered in gold and veils of bright color. The crowds, curious yet fearful, watched the strange procession. Some pretended reverence, others whispered in the shadows, unable to grasp the depths of their emperor's madness. It was a spectacle both fascinating and repulsive, a performance in which love blurred into tyranny and beauty into tragedy. During their long travels, Nero was careful to keep the illusion alive. He ordered the Greeks to receive them with nuptial honors and demanded that Sporus address guests with a soft voice and graceful gesture. Sometimes during banquets, the emperor would command him to sing, and even with a trembling, fragile voice, Sporus obeyed, fearing punishment. Around them, the courtiers feigned admiration, but their eyes betrayed unease. Everyone knew that behind the music and the smiles lay a suffering too dangerous to name. The psychological torment of Sporus ran deep. He had no identity left. He was a prisoner inside a mutilated body and a role he could never abandon. Each night, as he removed his ornaments, he might have searched the mirror for some trace of himself, but the reflection staring back no longer knew him. It was as if he lived inside another person's body. His exhausted mind oscillated between submission and despair. The Golden Palace, symbol of imperial glory, had become a silent cell where the emperor's laughter echoed like the mockery of the gods. There are accounts that, in fits of jealousy, Nero punished Sporus whenever he failed to behave exactly like Poppaea. A misplaced gesture, an unintended word, that was enough to ignite the emperor's fury. And afterward, repentant, Nero would smother him in gifts, necklaces, rings, rare fabrics. It was an endless cycle of violence and reward, destruction and false tenderness. Sporus was both trophy and captive, adored and erased. To the Roman people, that relationship mirrored everything the empire had become. Dazzling on the outside, rotten within. The image of the young man dressed as an empress had become the symbol of the throne's moral decay. Many saw in Sporus's public appearances the proof that Nero had lost his sanity entirely, and yet no one dared laugh. For in Nero's Rome, even laughter could be a crime. As the years passed, the weight of the farce became unbearable. Sporus grew increasingly distant, his eyes dimmed, his voice frail. There was no escape, not even in death, for both his life and his suffering belonged to the emperor. Each time Nero called him Sabina, the boy felt himself die a little more. In the end, his existence became a reflection of the empire that had created him. Magnificent in appearance, ruined in essence. Sporus lived on as both shadow and symbol, until Nero's own madness dragged them both into the abyss. But before the fall came the final act. A love turned into public spectacle, a marriage turned into humiliation, and an empire brought to its knees before the insanity. The story of Sporus, which had begun as a personal tragedy, soon spilled beyond the walls of the Domus Aurea and spread through all of Rome. The empire, long accustomed to excess and intrigue, had seen everything, but never anything so disturbing. The marriage between the emperor and a castrated youth was more than an eccentricity. It was a sign that something fundamental had shattered at the heart of power. The Roman throne, once the symbol of order and greatness, had become a stage for madness. In the plazas and marketplace, people whispered in fear. Rumors spread through taverns, public baths, and alleys where voices could hide. Some laughed nervously, saying that Caesar had finally gone mad. Others lowered their eyes, afraid that any word might reach the ears of the Praetorian Guard. Rome had endured tyrants before, but Nero was different. More theatrical, more unpredictable, more dangerous. And at the center of this spectacle of decay stood Sporus, the living symbol of submission and suffering. The Roman elites watched with a mixture of disgust and helplessness. Senators who had once governed with dignity now limited themselves to feigned approval. They knew that any criticism of the emperor could mean death. Many attended, heads bowed, the ceremonies in which Sporus was treated as empress, garments and jewels replacing the armor of reason. It was a grotesque theater in which everyone was forced to play a part, each applause a confession of fear. The marriage of Nero and the public existence of Sporus became the visible emblem of the corruption that devoured Rome from within. It was no longer about the emperor's personal depravity, but about a moral contagion that reached the Senate, the army, and the aristocracy itself. The old Rome that had once prided itself on discipline and virtue now bowed before insanity. The figure of Sporus, fragile, adorned, silent, represented not only a victim, but an entire empire kneeling before the madness of power. And Nero, blinded by vanity, failed to see how his behavior was feeding the silent contempt of the legions and the unrest of the province. As he paraded through palaces and theaters with his empress, the empire began to crumble behind the scene. Generals at the frontiers murmured, provincial governors doubted, and faith in the Roman throne crumbled like gold eaten away from its statue. The spectacle Nero had created to soothe his own pain had become the reflection of his ruin. Among ordinary citizens, the image of Sporus took on a near-mythic quality. Some pitied him, seeing him as a youth cursed by the gods. Others saw him with horror, as a reminder that no one was safe from imperial will. The name Sporus began to be whispered as a synonym for submission and loss of self, a single word that captured the distance between the man and the monster who ruled Rome. The Senate, Once the guardian of tradition was paralyzed, the laws still existed, but they were only echoes of past glory. Nero ruled not by reason, but by fear, and his court, a collection of flatterers and cowards, had become a mirror of the emperor himself. Beautiful on the outside, rotten within, the feasts, the banquets, and the theatrical performances masked an ever-deepening emptiness of power. With every forced laugh echoing through the palace, Rome moved closer to the abyss. And through it all, Sporus remained, silent, obedient, ever-present, as though part of the imperial furniture. He was displayed beside Nero in theaters, at religious ceremonies, even during political audiences. His presence, so artificial and tragic, reminded everyone how far the empire had strayed from its ideal. He was the face of humiliation turned into ornament, and still, Nero believed that all admired him. But the charade could not last forever. In the corridors of power, conspiracies grew like wheat. Generals prepared, senators plotted, and the Praetorian Guard, weary of serving an emperor who shamed Rome, began to fracture. The same madness that had turned Sporus into an empress would soon turn Nero into a fugitive. To the Roman people, Sporus and Nero were the two extremes of the same tragedy, the dominator and the dominated, the executioner and the victim, bound by a chain forged from pain and delusion. Rome saw in them its own reflection, grand, violent, and on the brink of collapse. And when the empire finally began to crumble, the name Sporus would remain as a reminder of how far humanity can fall when power knows no. When the empire finally turned against Nero in 68 AD, the spectacle ended as it had begun, in tragedy. Surrounded, betrayed, and terrified, humiliating execution, the emperor who had once proclaimed himself an artist, a god, and the lover of the world took his own life. He died alone, dagger in hand, uttering the words that would echo through the centuries. "What an artist the world loses in me." Thus ended the most extravagant and feared reign in Roman history. But for Sporus, Nero's death brought no relief. On the contrary, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in the same nightmare. With the emperor's fall, the imperial court was looted, and everything that had once belonged to him became the spoils of war. Among jewels, statues, and slaves was also Sporus, not as a person, but as a living symbol of a reign Rome longed to erase. The new men who took turns on the throne saw in the castrated youth a convenient relic, a trophy representing the end of Nero's madness. And so, once again, Sporus became the property of power. The first to inherit him was Galba, the aging general who seized the throne immediately after Nero's death. Cold and austere, Galba regarded Sporus merely as a curiosity, a living reminder of the chaos left behind by the previous emperor. There was no affection, nor was there cruelty, only indifference. Sporus was kept in the imperial residence, dressed simply, far from banquets and public appearances. Yet this quiet existence was only another kind of captivity. Galba treated him as something too valuable to discard, yet too useless to set free. His life was reduced to waiting, eating, sleeping, existing. But the empire at that time was a flickering flame. Galba was deposed and murdered within months. And as if Nero's curse still pursued him, Sporus was handed over to the next ruler, Otho. With Otho, Sporus's life seemed to breathe for a brief moment. Otho, who had once been Nero's ally and friend, knew the story well. Perhaps out of compassion, or because he saw in Sporus another soul deformed by tyranny, he treated him with kindness. He allowed the young man to move freely through the palace, provided him with fine clothing, and, according to some chroniclers, even spoke with him about the days of the golden. For a fleeting instant, Sporus felt something resembling dignity. But peace never lasted long. Otho's reign was short, a spark extinguished within months during the civil wars that ravaged Rome. Before his death, the emperor, defeated, ended his own life with a dignity Nero had never known. And once again, Sporus was left behind, delivered into the hands of the victor, Vitellius, the new master of. With Vitellius, the nightmare began anew. Unlike Otho, he saw in Sporus not a person but an opportunity for humiliation. Determined to erase every trace of Nero's era, he sought to turn the young man into a spectacle. According to ancient accounts, Vitellius ordered a public performance in which Sporus would be forced to play the role of Proserpina, the goddess abducted and violated by Pluto. The emperor intended to stage the myth before a cheering crowd, and Sporus would be the victim, exposed and degraded at the center of the arena. When he learned of the Sporus understood that life held no more escapes. He had been stripped of himself by Nero, objectified by Galba, and was now to be destroyed by Vitellius. There was no longer any place in the world where he could exist, not as a man, not as a woman, not even as a human being. On the night before the spectacle, Sporus made the only choice left to him. He refused to be, once again, a puppet of power. Having survived years of pain, humiliation, and emotional enslavement, he chose death. The chronicles say he did it silently, calmly, Perhaps for the first time, he felt what Nero never did, control over his own fate. By taking his own life, Sporus freed himself from the mask the empire had forced upon him. He died without witnesses, but his final act resounded as a cry of dignity. When the news reached Vitellius, he raged, not out of sorrow, but because his spectacle had lost its star. For Rome, however, Sporus's death passed almost unnoticed. An empire in crisis had no time to mourn its silent. Yet in the shadow of its ruins, his name lived on. A reminder of how far human cruelty can reach when power becomes a god without His story ended as it began, with a body destroyed by vanity and a silence that spoke louder than any speech. Sporus was not remembered as a hero, nor as a martyr, but his existence became the tragic mirror of an entire empire, brilliant in appearance, rotten at its core. When Vitellius ascended to the throne, Rome was already weary of emperor, but the new Caesar wanted to make his name through extravagance and spectacle. And to do so, he chose the darkest symbol of the previous era, Sporus. He ordered that the young man take part in a public performance at the amphitheater, portraying the goddess Proserpina being abducted and violated. It would not be theater, it would be humiliation, played out before thousands of eyes. For Vitellius, it was entertainment. For Sporus, it was the end. After all he had endured, the mutilation, the farce, the loss of his very self, he understood that there was nothing left to lose except the last spark of his own will. And for the first time since childhood, he chose to act not under command, but out of choice. On the night before the spectacle, he withdrew in silence. He left no words, no pleas, only a decision: to die free. His suicide was more than an act of despair. It was the only gesture of freedom that life had ever denied. In choosing death, Sporus denied the empire the pleasure of destroying him once more. The one who had been turned into a symbol of Nero's madness now became a symbol of resistance again. His death was the final cry of a soul that, though shattered, refused to be completely erased. And so, the young man once called Empress ended his story not as the possession of another man, but as the master of his own fate. In the silence of his passing, Rome lost more than a slave. It lost a reflection of its own humanity. This was the tragic and moving story of Sporus, the young man whose life was destroyed by the madness of an empire, and who, in the end, found freedom in the only place power could not reach him, in his own choice. If this story made you reflect on how deeply power can corrupt the human soul, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It matters more than you think. When you subscribe and engage, YouTube understands that this content has value and shares it with more people who love history, philosophy, and human stories as intense as this one. That's how we keep alive the memory and the lessons behind these forgotten. Write in the comments, what struck you most in the story of Sporus? Was it Nero's cruelty, Rome's indifference, or Sporus's final courage? Your opinion matters. I read all your comments and love reflecting with you on every detail. And of course, don't leave yet. The video appearing on your screen right now is even more fascinating and powerful than this one, a story that will surprise you and hold you from beginning to end. Click it and continue this journey through history with us.